After publishing 4 fantasy novels and teaching hundreds of writers in my programs, I've realized that there are 5 big differences between good world building and bad world building. I saw this in action when I ran a contest where 200 writers sent me their world building ideas. And if you're writing a fantasy novel and you want readers to be immersed and excited by your world, it's so crucial to understand these 5 key differences. The first key difference between good world building and bad world building is that bad world building just treats the world objectively, whereas good world building filters descriptions of that world through each character's specific lens, perspective, and attitude. And that allows you to develop both your world and your characters at the same time. Let me give you 2 examples that put this into practice. So first, let's consider a scene where we just described the world. The Grand Bazaar was a swirling mess of colorful silks, haggling merchants, and aromatic spices. Exotic animals paced back and forth in their cages, and the twangy music of a sitar sounded somewhere in the distance. High above, the burning sun stared down balefully from the vivid blue sky, like the eye of a watchful god. Okay, so that description isn't necessarily bad, but it doesn't really tell us anything about the character who is doing the describing. Now, of course, that might be a stylistic choice that you make as a writer. Maybe you want a more objective, detached style of description. However, in my experience as a reader, the stories I enjoy the most are the ones where we don't just describe how the world looks, but we also learn about how it makes your characters feel. So if we were to rework that example to bring across more character personality, here's what it might look like. The Grand Bazaar was a swirling mess of colorful silks, haggling merchants, and aromatic spices. Ciri found herself grinning at the exuberant, cheerful chaos. Exotic animals paced back and forth in their cages, and the twangy music of a sitar sounded somewhere in the distance. High above, the burning sun stared down balefully from the vivid blue sky, like the eye of a watchful god. Ciri ducked under an awning to get some shade. Before she could even wipe the sweat from her brow, a crafty-looking boy sidled up to her, holding a tray of fresh fruit. She probably should have ignored him, but she had plenty of time before the meeting, so she cheerfully bartered until he handed over a slice of the pinkish-red fruit. We've obviously made this example longer, but can you also see how we've come to understand not just the markets, but Ciri's own relationship and opinion of the markets as well? She very clearly finds this place quite exciting, playful, and a bit novel. This results in a far more immersive description because it is not just building the world and our understanding of the world, it is also building our understanding of our perspective character. And you can also imagine another character who comes into the markets and finds it too noisy and finds it annoying that this boy is trying to sell fruit at an overpriced rate to him and is just fed up with all the noise and clutter and chaos of it. That's also going to tell you something about that character. The second big difference between good and bad world building is that bad world building treats the world as an unchanging solid, whereas good world building acknowledges the truth that the world is a liquid and is constantly in a state of flux and change. I'm currently playing through a campaign of Baldur's Gate 3 with a couple of my friends. If you're not familiar with the game, it's basically like Dungeons and Dragons, but you're playing it on the computer. And something that I absolutely adore about this game is how consequential our decisions are. These tiny little decisions and moments that we have early in the story create these ripple effects later on in the narrative. And the world doesn't feel like it's just this static background where everything is kind of bolted down and you can't move anything around. It really feels like you can do anything and it's going to affect what you will see hours down the path in the game. And I really think that as a writer, you really want to create that same attitude with the stories you're telling. If the reader feels like the world is just this sort of unchanging, static thing where there's never really any progression or any meaningful change, that can work for some stories, but it's probably not going to be that interesting because it means that the actions of your characters don't feel that consequential. As soon as we see the ways in which your character's decisions ripple through the world and lead to really dramatic changes in some instances in the way that things are structured or the way that society is run, that's going to make us so much more invested because what you're showing there is that, hey, your characters actually have real consequence to their decisions. So we're going to be far more invested and just nervous when we see characters making those decisions. We know it is going to have a big impact on the world. I'm currently reading the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown, and this series does a fantastic job of it. When we first get into the series in book 1, the society of this futuristic world is very segmented and it's very ordered. You have the golds at the top, you have the reds at the bottom. But as our protagonist Darrow, who starts the story as a red and begins to kind of infiltrate the gold ranks and try to destroy them from within, as he goes through his quest to sort of bring equality to this world, we see that lead to really tumultuous effects, and the world doesn't just stay the same way it is in book 1. In every single book, there is a sense of progression and difference to the world. It really feels like it's evolving and is this liquid that is being shaped by the actions of our characters. Joe Abercrombie's The Age of Madness is another great example of this, where the whole point of that trilogy is we're seeing this sort of medieval fantasy world get dragged, kicking and screaming, into this industrializing age. And that is upsetting all of the existing power structures and hierarchies and just the way that society is organized. So don't be afraid to treat your world as a liquid that is going to change. The third big difference between good world building and bad world building is that bad world building often just draws from one point of inspiration, whereas good world building draws from many different sources to create something that feels original. When it comes to creating things, I often find that 1 + 1, that is, take this one source of inspiration and add it to this other source of inspiration, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. It equals 3, or sometimes it equals 10. And that is because when you sort of take all these different points of reference in your story, particularly from a world building perspective, and you find a way, an interesting and cohesive way to combine these and merge them together, it just results in a really fascinating outcome. The Stormlight Archive is actually a fantastic example of this. That's probably one of my favorite fantasy worlds out there. Sanderson has talked about how the Alethi culture from the Stormlight Archive is kind of inspired by Mongolian horse warriors. They have this very, conquering mindset, but in his mind, it's sort of once those horse warriors have conquered things and they're beginning to settle down in cities, yet they still have that very warrior ethos. But yet, he is also combining that with sort of Muslim modesty traditions, because in the culture of the Alethis, you have to cover your safe hand, right? Your left hand if you're a woman. And it's combining those different things that creates something that feels fresh. But of course, Stormlight doesn't stop there. You've also got the Shattered Plains, this massive sprawling landscape of canyons with plateaus between them, which is very inspired by the slot canyons in Utah. And then he also mentioned that he really wanted to write a story about giant crabs. And so that's where you get these massive sort of crustacean-based animals, which are in turn really well suited to survive the high storms that regularly sweep across this planet. And then you've also got power armor. You've got these giant mech suits that are done in a more sort of fantasy magical way with shardplate. And I could go on with this, right? And if you've read the Stormlight Archive, there's probably a bunch of other things you could think about here as well. But what I really like about this is that by blending and taking all these different sources of inspiration and kind of jumbling it up, it produces this really unique output. In my own writing, this is something I've thought about a lot. Like the Thunder Heist, for instance, is combining just a bunch of things I found really fascinating at the time. I've got, this sort of alchemical city where there is this sort of steampunk aesthetic to it. You've got this tower that is drawing energy from lightning, but there's also this monster-infested sea around it. You've got these people who are sort of half fish, half human, basically. You've also got people who are slowly turning into vines or slowly turning into crystal, if we look at some of the other mutants in this story. And there's just a bunch of other things that I've shoved in there as well. And you might think that having a bunch of different inspirations makes your world building lacking in cohesion. Sometimes that is a danger, yes, but more often than not, I find that your ideas will find a way to mesh together and really combine to create something that doesn't feel like a big hodgepodge, but actually feels like all of these things are suitable for each other. Now, speaking of cohesion, the fourth big difference between bad and good world building is that bad world building just throws a bunch of random ideas at you that sound cool, whereas good world building focuses on creating unity and resonance between your world building, your plot, your characters, and your theme. So there's a tool I often talk about with my students called the triangle of story. The idea with this diagram is to remind yourself that whenever you are developing one aspect of your story, whether you're developing your characters, whether you're coming up with different plot ideas, whether you're coming up with different world building concepts or different setting concepts, you always want to find ways to link them to the other points of this triangle. You always want to find ways to use your world building to enhance your character arcs, or to use your characters to say something interesting about your world building. This is really the key to the previous point I was talking about, making sure that if you are getting a bunch of different concepts together, making sure that they don't feel like a hodgepodge of random ideas. It all comes back down to this, to trying to find cohesion between these main elements of your story. So if we take a story like The Gutter Prep by Gareth Hanrahan, for example, that is a book where I would say there is a tremendously good sense of cohesion between the characters, plot, and setting. I would describe the story as a very dark political thriller about three thieves who are trying to survive in this city when they are embroiled in these really dark conspiracies. And there's all sorts of raging gods around them and monsters and forces just trying to control Gurdon, the main city from this story. And without really going deep into the specifics of the plot here, it's a story which is all about spies and betrayal and seedy secrets and the underbelly of politics and governance. And so it makes a lot of sense that the city of Gurdon is not this bright, breezy, really cheerful place full of sunshine and rainbows. It is this very like industrial, alchemical city kind of inspired by like 19th century Glasgow. And there's all these like hidden catacombs underneath the city. There's massive factories that are belching, smoke out into the sky. Even the weather is just as unpredictable as the people in the city itself. And so the very geography and urban design of the city is really mirroring the sort of type of conflicts that the characters have to go up against. And I find as a writer that it is so fun to just look at the core of your story, to look at the themes you're exploring, to look at the sort of main arcs your characters are going on, and then find ways to sort of manifest that within the world they explore. A really useful framework and kind of gold standard to work towards here is that you want to design your world building plot and characters with such a sense of cohesion between them that if you took one of these elements out and you put it in a different story or in a different setting, in a different world, it wouldn't make any sense. So for instance, you can't really separate Harry Potter, the character, from Hogwarts. That is a vital part of who he is as a character. So that means that there is a lot of synthesis in terms of the world building and the character design in that story. And then if you think about the plots in every single Harry Potter book, apart from maybe Deathly Hallows, the 7th book, they are all really deeply integrated into Hogwarts. If you look at something like the Chamber of Secrets, right? It's literally this secret chamber in Hogwarts. We're having to delve into the world building. We're having to learn about the history of this world and the way it operates in order to advance the plot forward. There is a really strong sense of cohesion there, and you want to aim for the same thing in your writing. And then the fifth big difference between good world building and bad world building is that bad world building treats cultures as monoliths, whereas good world building acknowledges that even within a particular group or within a particular society that has strong beliefs, people are going to have their own interpretations of things. So I actually talked about this in a recent podcast episode with Austin and Richard over on the Two to Ramble podcast, which is my favorite book review podcast. And we were talking about what makes for a good fantasy religion. And one of the things I said is this idea that I think the most interesting fantasy religions are the ones where you don't have 100 people all with the exact same interpretations and beliefs and ways of expressing that religion, but rather you show reality, which is that even within the most unified group, you're all going to have people who have their own different opinions and interpretations on things. You only have to look at the religions in our real world to see this, right? Even within one religion where people agree on 99% of stuff, they will literally go to war over the 1% of things they don't agree on. And so whenever you find yourself creating like a group in your world that has a very strong identity, maybe you're creating something like a warrior culture, right? Where the most important thing is to be a good warrior. I think that it's so important to try and add realism to that by showing that different people are going to express that belief and respond to that belief in different ways. You might have some warriors in that culture who just love bloodlust, they love killing people, they really get off on it. Then you might have other warriors who kind of approach fighting and approach warfare from a more honorable perspective, and they're actually willing to spare people if they surrender. Then you might even have some characters who resent the fact that they have to fight, but they need to do it for the money. So there's no real deeper purpose or deeper mission to what they're doing. They're just fighting because they like money. Then you might have other characters who see their fighting and their warfare as a holy mission that they have to do for their gods. So if you are writing about a society that has a really strong belief around something, which is very common when you are world building in your fantasy novel, try to find ways to show the dissenting opinions amongst that society or that group. It's going to make it feel so much more realistic, and it's going to create much richer conflict in your story. Now, if you would like to learn more about world building, check out this video over here, where I break down 15 world building lessons I learned from publishing my 4 fantasy novels and my interactive fiction game. A lot of these lessons are things that you don't really hear people discuss that often, and it took me years to learn them in a lot of cases. So I think you'll find it useful. Keep writing and keep striving, and I'll see you in the next video.